The police kill people fairly regularly and use lower levels of violence as a matter of routine. No one keeps very good track of the numbers, but the few existing studies establish something of a pattern. According to a 2005 Justice Department survey, 19% of the American public had direct contact with the police during the previous year. Most of these contacts took the form of traffic stops, and most were unremarkable. Only 1.6% of the people interviewed reported the use of force or the threat of force. That means out of every 100 people the police come into contact with, they will threaten or use force against one or two of them. This rate is much higher for blacks, 4.4%, and Hispanics, 2.3%, than for whites, 1.2%. That 1.6% adds up quickly. Almost 1 million people were subject to the use of or threat of force at the hands of police sometime in 2005. In 55% of these cases, force was actually used. If we got all of those people together, you'd have a group as large as the population of Portland. That same year, 57,546 officers were assaulted in the line of duty, representing 11.9 assaults per 100 officers. Most of these reported assaults involved unarmed assailants and produced no injuries. The vast majority of attackers, 80%, used only personal weapons such as hands, fists, or feet. Only 3.7 used firearms. Only about a quarter of these, 27.4%, resulted in injury to the officer. Comparing the numbers, we see that the police use violence 9 times as often as they face it. An analysis of fatal incidents shows a similar imbalance. During the period of 2003 to 2005, 380 police died on duty. Only 159 of these deaths were homicides, and 221 were results of accidents. During the same period, 1,095 people were killed by law enforcement officers in the process of arrest. That averages 365 per year, or 1 a day. Of the people killed by the police killed, nearly all were men, 96.8%. Disproportionately many were black, and the median age was 33. 3/4 were suspected of violent crimes, including 26.1% for crimes against the police. 8% of victims were accused of public order offenses, 3.9% property offenses, 2.9% drug offenses, and 2.5%, approximately 27 people, were not suspected of any crime at all, but were being taken into custody for medical or mental health reasons when they were killed by the police. In 80% of these cases, the victim had a weapon, but only in 16.9% did they fight with officers. 36%, or 38 people, were killed after they had been restrained. 96.3% were shot. So I just want to go back and to look at that statistic. So only 3.7% of officers who were harmed or killed had weapons used against them. 3.7%, but in the number of people who were shot by the police, killed by the police, 96.3 were shot. The exact opposite percentage. In Oregon, during the years in question, no cops were murdered, but 36 people were killed by the police. In Washington, 3 cops were murdered and 35 arrestees were murdered. In California, 17 cops were killed and 160 arrestees were killed by the police. If we assume 1 killer per victim, then there are about 6.7 killer cops for every 1 cop killer. These numbers are in keeping with the long-term pattern. The Justice Department reports that between 1976 and 1998, 8,578 felons were justifiably killed by police in the United States, unquote, while 1,820 law enforcement officers were murdered, unquote, during the same period. Notice alongside the imbalance of the numbers, the bias in the language. Law enforcement officers were murdered, while felons were justifiably killed. Now, in case anyone thinks that this is dramatically different for Canada, I'll remind you that last summer, 9 Indigenous people were shot and killed by police in the space of about 6 weeks. By comparison of a population of Canada, if those people were white, it would have represented more than 200 people killed by police. Suck on that. Violence is a core function of policing, and the injustices of policing both reflect and reproduce the injustices of our society. The targets of police attention, and therefore also of police violence, reflect and reinforce existing inequalities of both race and class. At the same time, the character of police violence and the ideology supporting it, the idea that violence is a contest between male antagonists, and the casting of police as chivalrous protectors, is itself deeply complicit in the subjugation of women and is historically linked to racial myths about the purity of white womanhood and black sexual aggression. There's not a review board in the world that can touch these fundamental inequalities. To do so would require more than some simple revisions to police policy. It would require the restructuring of our entire society. To be ultimately effective then, the fight against police brutality needs to adopt a police abolitionist perspective, rather than a more limited reform or accountability framework. And it must necessarily be part of a much broader social movement. Our job must be to defeat the cops politically. In the most general terms, that means broadening, deepening, and extending the crisis. Such an effort requires that we add to political distrust of the police and undercut public support. We have to be radical in our approach to each side of this equation, going to the root of both the distrust and support. Public suspicion of the police, already acute in many corners, can be deepened by exposing not just individual abuses or even whole patterns of abuse, but the basic function of the institution and its use of violence to preserve social inequality. Public support, meanwhile, can be undercut by providing alternative means to resolve disputes, address interpersonal conflict, and ensure public safety. These are the functions that, however badly the cops perform them, the public presently feels itself dependent on the police to provide. Our strategy should be simultaneously to attack the core function of policing and to remove the basis of its legitimacy, thus shifting support away from the police and towards our social movements. If the public loses faith in the police, if it does not feel dependent on them for protection, then people are less likely to cooperate with the cops and more likely to resist. Tactically, we have to learn to use the state's strengths against it and to use its weaknesses against it as well. We have to establish the political conditions such that the cops' tactical victories become political liabilities, and their tactical defeats are only signs of their weakness. In other words, we need to make sure that the cops' violence costs them in terms of legitimacy, while violence used against police only shows that they are vulnerable to attack. Until recently, the left's nonviolent posturing has made it hard to recognize attacks against the police as political resistance. The depoliticization of anti-police violence, in effect, cedes to the state the right to define not only legitimate force, but legitimate resistance as well. It allows the police to convert attacks against them into a source of legitimacy. And it accommodates the narrative by which the state's violence is always defensive, thus justified. The standard view of anti-police violence forces the left to seek out and prioritize a few idealized, innocent victims. By omission, this legalistic or moralistic approach seems to justify the police use of force so long as it is not, by the state standard, excessive. From the state's perspective, therefore, police violence is presumably legitimate. The violence against police is presumably illegitimate. the left has had a tendency to challenge the first premise and endorse the second. But if we accept that police violence is political and not merely a technical problem, then it follows that we need to understand the violence against police as political as well. We need a more nuanced analysis of its causes, of the forces that propel people toward it, of its consequences, both personal and socially, and of its meaning, its express content, intentionality, and implications. In short, we need to discuss the violence against police not simply in terms of crime, but in terms of resistance. This is not to say that those who attack the police, or who simply defend themselves against a police attack, have a self-conscious ideological motivation or an explicit political agenda. It is also not to say that the left necessarily needs to condone, endorse, advocate, or use violence. Violence, whether in general or in particular cases, must still be subject to criticism on ethical, political, strategic, and tactical grounds. I think it's time the left change its understanding of anti-cop violence. Not because I think we need to use violence against the police, but because we need to stop the police from using the violence they face as a pretext to justify the violence they employ. The role of the police, at its most basic, is to keep this system of extortion in place, and in particular, to keep it in place by using surveillance and control and violence to control those portions of the population most likely to cause it trouble. In other words, to control workers and poor people. And since the US and Canada is stratified by race as well as class, people of color in particular, this function goes back to the very origin of policing. The modern institution of the police force, as I argue in Our Enemies in Blue, evolved from an earlier type of organization called the slave patrols. These slave patrols were militia-based groups charged with keeping slaves on the plantations and, just as importantly, preventing revolts. Over the course of decades, the slave patrols gradually became professionalized and acquired additional responsibilities, transitioning just after the American Revolution into a body easily recognizable as a modern police force. This dual social function, preserving racial and class inequality, is a much better indicator of what the police are going to do than are either the laws or concerns about public safety. That function has remained remarkably stable over the 2 centuries since the institution emerged, even as laws have changed. For example, in terms of day-to-day policing, police enforced past laws to prevent slaves from traveling, enforced legal segregation in the days of Jim Crow, and now, in an era of legal equality, they still engage in racial profiling, which has the effect of limiting the mobility of people of color and restricting their access to resources. Similarly, in the 19th century, the cops enforced vagrancy laws, and today, without having to change their behavior in the least, they enforce laws against sleeping on the sidewalk, trespassing under bridges, and panhandling. It is no surprise, then, that collective action intended to address these social inequities is met with police repression. The cops, historically, have been the enemies of both the labor movement and the civil rights movement. They've attacked picket lines, broken up demonstrations, raided offices, tapped phones, opened mail, sent informants and agents provocateurs into organizations, jailed organizers, and assassinated leaders. That's the job. That's what they do. Why should we expect any different? Well, the truth is that some people did expect different, or at least they hoped for something better. That was the impulse behind the slogan about police being part of the 99%. An uncharitable person might note that this mistake points to the vacuity of the 99% idea. However, one does also have to admit that, by some measures, the police may qualify as working class. They tend to come from working class families, they work for wages, have low social status, and are organized in unions. All of that, plus perhaps the short-lived support some cops showed for the labor demonstrations in Wisconsin early in 2011. may have led some in Occupy to expect that the cops would be on our side. What these rather optimistic observers fail to recognize, apparently, is the fact that cops' jobs, in large part, is to monitor and control the working population. As I argued in Our Enemies in Blue, that leaves them in something of an ambivalent class position. Patrol officers may stand at the bottom of their institutional hierarchy, but their profession, taken as a whole, has to be considered part of the managerial apparatus of capitalism. Whatever their personal sympathies may lie, their institutional role makes them the representatives and guardians of the interests of the capitalists. And curiously, the police union is one of the mechanisms that has developed to ensure they remain reliable in that role. Just as police work is not like other work, police unions are not like other unions. Following World War II, as cops began to show an interest in collective bargaining and other municipal employees gained the right to organize, police commanders very cannily opened an avenue that would simultaneously allow for negotiation and avoid the dangers of police joining a broader labor alliance. Police administrators started allowing, encouraging, or in some cases creating police-only unions. From the perspective of the local authorities, these police unions had several advantages. They institutionalized negotiations, which allowed conflict within the police department to be resolved through legalistic, routinized means. Further, separate unions meant that the police could be always treated as a special case during budget planning and contract talks, granting them pay, benefits, and pensions far better than those of other government workers. Police unions organized the cops as cops, rather than as workers, encouraging an identification with the police institution as a whole and cementing a kind of vertical solidarity. And for all these reasons, police unions allowed local governments to keep the police in reserve, away from the main body of the labor movement, and ready to act against striking workers. The implication is that, while some cops may offer signs of support, from a word of encouragement to a refusal to fire their tear gas, these actions should be appreciated for what they are, individual expressions of sympathy or small acts of resistance. Their source will likely be the conscience of the officer, and the police union will usually not be the vehicle through which it finds expression. We should encourage this sort of dissent within the ranks, and should the need arise, support whistleblowers or cops who refuse to perform riot duty. But we should not kid ourselves about the ultimate significance of such acts, or their potential to blossom into mutiny. Most of these gestures are exactly that, gestures. They may mean something, but they don't necessarily do very much to change the situation. On the other hand, an abundance of sympathy for the police may have real consequences, not only in terms of discouraging militant resistance, but also in alienating people of color and anyone else who has good reason to mistrust people who try to align with the cops. My rather cynical take on the issue is this. To the degree that cops identify with the workers, good. To the degree that workers identify with the cops, bad. At its most basic, the primary function of the criminal justice system isn't really dealing with crime or ensuring public safety or even enforcing the law. All of these are secondary. The chief function is the preservation of the existing distribution of power, keeping the rich and powerful, and keeping the poor and powerless, poor and powerless. The modern American police, for example, evolved from the earlier slave patrols, organizations whose explicit job was to control the slaves. Over time, their duties expanded in two directions: control of the entire black population, including free blacks, and governing poor whites as well. And just in case people want to think that Canada is any different, well, we have the Northwest Mounted Police, aka the RCMP, that were designed to control, surveil, and kill Indigenous people. Likewise, the penitentiary began in its European version as an institution for reforming the habits of the idle poor. It took on its distinctly American characteristics after the Civil War, as a means of reconfining the newly freed black population. This legacy continues today with routine police practices like racial profiling and quality of life campaigns against panhandling and sleeping in parks. These efforts have had no impact on real crime, but they serve to remind the poor and people of color of their subordinate status and to keep them under the continual monitoring and control of the justice system. In this sense, the whole operation of the criminal justice system is political. It is one way that the state handles its troublesome populations, and one way that it protects the interests of the powerful.